Our Stories, celebrating 4 decades of living in the community. Over the past 40 years, there has been a tremendous change in how people with developmental disabilities are cared for in Massachusetts and throughout the country. In the first half of the 20th century, parents of children with developmental disabilities were encouraged to place them in institutions early on. The thinking was that these children required too much special care for families to deal with, the public schools weren't equipped to educate them, and that institutions were the best place for them. Families who decided not to place their children in institutions had to fend for themselves. The network of services that could support families to care for special needs children at home had not yet been developed. The only alternative to the state institutions, a small number of private programs, were only within the reach of the very rich. The institutions for the mentally retarded, called state schools in Massachusetts, were created in the 19th century as part of a reform movement. Prior to that, the state assumed no responsibility for caring for people with intellectual disabilities, and they, along with all rogues, vagabonds, and idle persons, were relegated to almshouses. In 1751, a hospital in Philadelphia created a separate section for people with mental retardation and people with mental illness. By 1756, they were putting these people on display for a small fee. In the 1960s, the principles of the civil rights movement began to be applied to disadvantaged groups whose rights were being denied. In 1963, President Kennedy tried to reverse the flow of people into public institutions. He called for a reduction over a number of years and by hundreds of thousands of people confined to residential institutions. He asked that methods be found, quote, to retain and return to the community the mentally ill and mentally retarded, and there to restore and revitalize their lives through better health programs and strengthened educational and rehabilitation services. At the same time, parent groups were established to improve the lives of their children with intellectual disabilities. In 1972, Benjamin Ricci, the president of the Belchertown Friends Board and father of Robert Ricci, a resident of the Belchertown State School, filed a class action suit against the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for the substandard care provided at Belchertown and 4 other state schools in Massachusetts. This suit resulted in a consent decree that required the Commonwealth to greatly improve conditions in the institutions. Rather than rebuild the institutions to provide top quality care for the thousands of residents who were living there at the time, the Commonwealth used the consent decree as an opportunity to invest resources in building a model system for care in the community. Though the state followed through in upgrading care and institutions, they steadily moved residents into community programs, reducing the population in state schools over time. MAB was an early participant in the deinstitutionalization movement. In 1973, MAB worked with the Commonwealth to design a residential life learning program to prepare people who were both blind and intellectually disabled for life in the community. The program was housed at Sunlight House in Scituate, which MAB had used as a short-term vacation house for people who were blind, including blind residents of the state schools. The first long-term residents of Sunlight House were 8 men who had lived their entire lives in institutions and lacked even the most basic personal skills. They could not count, brush their teeth, or even recall their own last names. The severe social retardation that lifelong institutionalization had forced upon them had discouraged them from ever trying to take care of themselves. At Sunlight House, these men were assigned responsibilities, instructed in daily living skills, and given job training. Within 18 months, they all held reasonably demanding jobs, and with the help of a volunteer, arranged a trip to Washington, D.C., which included having lunch with their congressmen. Now, almost 40 years later, MAB serves more than 100 adults who are developmentally disabled or brain injured in residential, vocational, and day habilitation programs in Greater Boston. About half of these people are blind or visually impaired. It seems most fitting to celebrate this move to community living through the life stories of some of the people we serve. Their stories dramatically illustrate the great change that they have borne witness to in our society. Ruthie. When my sister Ruthie was born in 1933, they had to give her a transfusion, and the procedure caused a seizure. They did an x-ray and saw a huge black spot on the top of her brain. The doctor told my mother that the baby wouldn't live to be a year old, and that the best thing to do would be to place her in an institution. When Ruthie was 5 months old, my mother took her to Fernald School, kissed her goodbye, and never went back. For years, my mother thought Ruthie had died. 55 years later, my mother's friend contacted her and let her know that Ruthie was still alive and living in a home for the blind outside of Boston. My mother was stunned. We couldn't believe it. None of us ever knew about Ruthie. After learning that Ruthie was alive, my mother took a trip to Massachusetts. She found out where Ruthie was, but she couldn't bring herself to go see her. It was too painful to her that she had abandoned this baby. 5 years later, I asked if she wanted me to go with her to Massachusetts to see Ruthie. She kind of jumped at the idea. We didn't know what to expect. We didn't know how she'd feel about meeting us. We were there for a week, and she loved to go shopping. So the first place we took her was to the mall. We were going down the aisles, and oh my god, it was so much fun. Ruthie could only see a little bit, but she loved the color red. She picked out a red sweater and a red blouse. When we went to the counter and checked out, she'd stop everyone we met and say, "I got this." She'd open the bag and pull out the sweater to show them. She was so happy. It was amazing. She had perfectly picked it, you know? When I first met Ruthie, I didn't know what to expect. I thought, oh my god, what are people going to think? Am I going to be embarrassed that she's my sister? I'm going to take her anywhere I want, and people can just get over it. Ruthie died a year ago, March. During the last 13 years of her life, we became real sisters. We talked on the phone, we baked cookies, and we went to the beach. We picnicked in the redwood groves and went to a hot air balloon festival. She loved to go bowling and especially liked pink bowling shoes. She always had a big smile for everyone she met. She couldn't read or spell, but she knew so much about people, how to make them feel comfortable, how to make them happy. She loved magazines. She'd draw with markers on each page. I like that, she'd say. So exuberant. She had a boyfriend, and they went to dances at church. Did you go with your boyfriend, I'd ask on the phone. Yeah, she'd say. Did your feet hurt? And she'd always say, don't worry about that. Based on an interview with Ruthie's sister, Carlene, in memory of Ruthie herself, an MAB resident for 35 years. Bob. My father was an alcoholic and always came home drunk. He picked on me because I was the youngest. Couldn't pick on my brothers because they'd break his neck. He'd take a chain to try to choke me with it. I was born blind and I had seizures where my right hand would shake and everything would be spinning and I couldn't speak. Somebody suggested to my mother that they put me in Monson State to see if they could cure me. I was 12. Monson State was murder. Oh, Christ. They were going on like madmen over there, yelling, screaming, and hitting each other. They had me working all the time. I had 2 wards that I had to take care of, 12 patients in one and 14 in the other. I had to bathe them, shave them, and I even had to dress a couple of them. Some would want to go out, so I'd take them out and bring them back. About half the time I couldn't take them out because I was the only attendant on the ward. I had to work day and night with no help. One time the superintendent came in and said, "Where's the rest of them? The paid help?" We took a walk to the attendant's room. I had a key that opened every door. We went down to the basement. I opened the door, and there they were, all dead drunk and sleeping it off. Then he says, "You got any more?" I said, "Yeah, 1 more floor." So we went up to the last floor. Same thing, sleeping. That's around when I started getting ready to leave Monson State. I met Teresa at Monson State. She was my girlfriend all these years. I took that girl everywhere. Even places she didn't want to go, she went anyway. I took her to KFC out in Brighton and Newton. I took her to the country buffet at the Watertown Mall. Teresa dying was a real heartbreaker. She died just about where you're sitting in that chair. We were going to get married, but she said she couldn't on account of her seizures. She'd black out, and then 15 minutes later she'd have another. I did everything I could for her. I've had the same friends for almost 40 years. Curtis and Albert were at Sunlight House with me. Richard and Donnie were at 190 Ivy Street. Donnie's real smart. He goes to work without a cane, and Richard has a big record collection, saw half of them and said, "What the heck do you have there?" I love country music. The big man upstairs isn't ready for me yet. If I have to live my life all over again, I don't think I'd change any of it. Leave it just the way it is. Based on an interview with Bob, an MAB resident since 1974 who lives in Dedham. Brendan. When Brendan was born, he was beautiful, but he had a big head. The doctors did a lot of testing, but concluded that we must just have big heads in our family. By the time he was 18 months old, he was behind on all of his developmental milestones, and it was clear he was delayed. He was so sweet and lovable, but he wasn't progressing according to the normal timetable. We got him involved in early intervention, and the doctors recommended a wait-and-see approach, so I was surprised when he was ready to enter kindergarten, and they recommended a totally separate special needs classroom. Right from the beginning, school was a nightmare for Brendan. The other kids teased and made fun of him, even in a special needs classroom. He didn't have any friends, and they called him names. It made me so furious. I felt helpless. There was nothing I could do to protect him. When Brendan came to the Ivy Street school, it was the first time he really felt safe. No one made fun of him. He didn't have to feel ashamed. Everyone accepted him for who he was, and he progressed. I'll never forget the day he called me as he was walking to Trader Joe's by himself for the first time. I was so proud of him and so happy for that independence. As an adult, he's really blossomed. He has a job washing dishes at Matilda's, a coffee shop in Watertown. They love him there. He works 5 days a week and volunteers walking dogs at the MSPCA. He met a girl at the MSPCA who he likes, but was too nervous to talk to her for a long time. He recently broke the ice with a conversation about Harry Potter. He blushes when he talks about her. He lives in a group home in Brookline with 4 other guys his age. He knew a couple of them from Ivy Street. In a few years, we hope he'll be able to move towards having more independence. He spends a lot of his free time reading. He loves Stephen King, the scarier the better. He loves walking to the Chinese restaurant near his house and grabbing dinner. He loves watching movies with the family and going tubing in the summer. I love that he has a real life like everyone else. It's so important that he's been treated with respect and given choices about the life he wants for himself. He's a contributing member of society and has relationships with people that make him happy. That's all I want for him, to be happy. At Ivy Street, Brendan did a stand-up comedy routine at the talent show. He was amazing, so comfortable in his own skin. I asked him how he learned to do that. He said, "Sometimes I study other comedians. Maybe I'm just gifted." Based on an interview with Brendan and his mother, Tony, Brendan, 23, lives with 4 other guys in their 20s in Brookline. Brian. By age 2, Brian had had 5 surgeries on his eyes, which left him totally blind in one and with light perception in the other. They diagnosed him as being moderately retarded, so right from the beginning, doctors were telling my parents to institutionalize him. My mother would cry for weeks on end. My dad was just stubborn Irish. "That's not going to happen. Not to my boy. Not to my son. We will keep him at home." It was hard being the sibling. The focus was always on what he couldn't do. On one particularly bad day, Brian couldn't button his shirt. My mother was crying and my father was yelling, and Brian was a nervous wreck. Finally, I stood up and said, "Both of you stop," and I took Brian to his bedroom and I closed the door. I told him, "We're not leaving this room until you get it right. Do you want Mom crying and Dad yelling at you?" And he said, "No, Diane, I don't like it when Dad yells." We were in that room for 4 hours, doing it over and over again, trying different techniques. Periodically, I'd hear my parents eavesdropping and whispering at the door. We had high and low points, but after 4 hours we walked out and I said, "Brian, do you have something that you'd like to show Mom and Dad?" And he said, "Yes, Mom and Dad, I have something to show you. I can button my own shirt." He proceeded to button his shirt. Mom and Dad both sat there and sobbed. My dad taught Brian to swim. He was afraid of the ocean because he didn't see it coming. The lake was okay. My dad would walk backward, and Brian would rest his hands on his palms, and step by step we got Brian into the water. He would go out as far as his waist and splash. There are pictures of him, head up to the sky, laughing because he actually enjoyed being in the water. Being introduced to MAB was the best thing for Brian, because they have a holistic approach that could deal with his handicaps. Every other place would just deal with one part of the problem. It's been great to watch this evolution from he'll never amount to anything to him having a full-time job and friends and a mobility cane to get around with. It's like everything I remember hearing them say Brian couldn't do, he's doing. He's independent. He lives in his own apartment. He goes to work. He has friends. He does social things. He goes out for a haircut. Brian's dependence on my mom is diminishing. As he's become involved in MAB social events, the dependence has lessened. That would never have happened if he hadn't gotten immersed in his own life. I want him to know that he has family and support, but I also want him to have his own life. Based on an interview with Brian and his sister Diane, Brian, 57, lives in Newton. To learn more about our stories or any of the MAB Community Service programs, please visit www.mabcommunity.org.